So you've been working on this article for about a year now.
About a year and a half, almost 2 years.
So, I mean, that's like a book. That's an amount of time you normally hear about a book.
Right.
How did you go about it? I mean, the article begins with Clyde Ross.
Right.
And the article is substantially set in Chicago, where you don't live.
Right.
How did you choose Chicago? How did you find Clyde Ross?
Okay, so we can start the last question first, finding Clyde Ross. The historian Burl Satter, who's at Rutgers, wrote an extraordinary book called Family Properties. And Family Properties is a history of redlining and housing in Chicago, set in North Lawndale, particularly about one of the big activist groups, the Contract Buyers League in there. Clyde Ross is mentioned in the book, and a bunch of other people who were alive at the time that Professor Satter published the book, are in that book. But the other thing that's in that book, which is absolutely fascinating, is an Atlantic article from 1972. And that article, I mean, people think my article was on that. I think that article was like 30,000 words. And it's all about the Contract Buyers League and redlining, and Clyde Ross is in that article. I didn't know Mr. Ross's story at all. So I didn't it wasn't like I went looking. I was, saw in her book, I said, I want that guy. But the first thing I did after I finished it was I sent an email to Burl and I said, are any of these people still alive? Do you think any of these people, so I think her book might have came out in like 2005, so significant time had passed. And I asked, I said, do you think any of these people are still alive? And she said, I don't know, but I can put you in touch with Jack McNamara, who's one of the big organizers for the Contract Buyers League. I wrote him, we talked on the phone a couple times. He said, well, I'll go see who's alive. And Jack was an angel. Oh my God. He pulled together a spreadsheet of all the members and what their status was, and whether we could get to children or whether we could get to them. I mean, this was the cause of his life for a while. So the idea that it was gonna, still, that somebody was saying it still had resonance was just so, I think it just warmed his heart. And so I went to Chicago. Mr. Ross was one of the people on the list. In fact, he was the first person on the list. And I talked to him, and the first thing he said was, I said, Mr. Ross, where were you born? He said, Clarksdale, Mississippi. And I said, why did you leave Clarksdale? And he said, I wanted the protection of the law. And, Mr. Ross has a thick Mississippi accent, so I wasn't sure if I was hearing him right. And I said, why? He said, no, I wanted, he said, I wanted protection of the law. I said, what does that mean? He said, well, when I was in Mississippi, there were no black police officers. There were no black prosecutors, no black judges, no black defense attorneys, no black anything. We were effectively outside of the law. If something happened to us, we had no recourse at all. People could basically do whatever they wanted to us. And then, I asked him how, and he went, right down the list. As he said, his list of losses that he had taken. We read about this sort of thing in books, right? And by the time I got to Mr. Ross, it must have been like the spring of last year. And by then I had been doing quite a bit of research. I had probably about 6 to 8 months of research that I had already put in, just trying to understand housing in Chicago. Nothing compares to somebody actually telling you, in detail how they were ripped off. It was extraordinary.
One of the things about the article that I think when you first see the framing, when people think about reparations, they think about slavery.
Right.
Reading the article, slavery is not the moral core of it.
No.
Housing discrimination is, primarily.
Right.
And is that why? Is it this idea that slavery, abhorrent as it was actually like sanctioned law? And then after that, America moved into a gray period where we actually had essentially an illegal regime around African Americans?
I think that the thing is that after slavery, we had Reconstruction, and we had this period where we tried to make it right briefly. We could have made it right. And, had we made it right, we wouldn't be having, this discussion at all. You're right, slavery is, to the back in the story, but housing discrimination is actually the legacy of slavery. There would be no reason for, housing discrimination, for redlining, if not for enslavement. That's what, the reason why it happened to begin with. That's the long echo of never having to deal with it to begin with. So, I mean, I focus on a particular portion of it, a particular portion of the legacy of white supremacy, but it's very tough in my mind to actually separate one from the other, in fact. And the way I wrote it, when I wrote the historical portion, I tried to write it as a continuance, as a continuum, not as a break, and then you had this and then you had that. The dominant feature in African-American life and African-American history in this country is unfreedom, is having less freedom than our fellow citizens. And you see that obviously in slavery in its most extreme. After enslavement, you lose, thank God, the right to sell people's children and put them on the auction block. But unfreedom is still there in the form of debt peonage, in the form of vagrancy laws where people are arrested and, put in prison and having having to work. Douglas Blackman has that great book, Slavery by Another Name. And then housing discrimination, where you don't have the right to live where you want. And you're effectively crammed into, slums and, all these awful sort of things happen. So I saw it as a continuum, focusing on, a particular point. You're correct. I think the fact that folks are still alive and still around makes it particularly poignant, that I start not with some guy who died in 1890, but a guy who's right there living on, the west side of Chicago right now, who was stolen from. I think that helps the emotional power of it. But, it's very hard for me to break it, in the periods like that.
This article is kind of hit like a bomb. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about the reaction to it, and the reaction I had to it as a reader, is, and I don't want this to come out the wrong way, there's nothing new in there.
No.
It is synthesis, not uncovering new details.
Right.
It's not investigative reporting in that way. Why did you think that an article like this had to be written now? When you sent that email to your editor, I guess a year and a half ago, why did you think that there was a need for an article that summed up what we knew about American racism?
I guess because we don't know, and by which I mean there are people who are experts in this field. There are people who write about American history. There are people who write sociology, who know. Okay, who it's their job to know. There are considerably fewer journalists who know, and there are considerably fewer Americans who know. And that was clarified for me repeatedly in the kind of back and forth debates I would get into, about any old thing, with folks online. It was quite clear that there's a whole era. So one of the reasons why I chose Chicago is because Chicago had been in the news, as, sort of this epicenter of quote unquote black on black crime. And there'd been all this talk about murders, but the conversation was there was no question, why do people live like this? How did this come to be to begin with? How did this situation actually transpire? I went to Chicago for the first time as an adult in 1995, and I was driving down the Dan Ryan Express, and at that time, there was a stretch of projects, infamous projects, the famous Robert Taylor Homes. It occurred to me as an absolute monstrosity. And I thought of it as a moral monstrosity. It never occurred to me that somebody with specific attention to race and racism had plotted for people to live in that sort of way. And I mean that, anybody who does any research on public housing in Chicago, that's exactly what happened. Public housing was put up on a segregated basis. But somehow, we've forgotten that. Or we want to forget it. I think you're right, it doesn't uncover anything new. It's a reminder, though, that, if you're going to go on television, and you're going to talk about the murder rate in Chicago, or you're going to talk about, the shape of African-American families, or you're going to, stand up and lecture black men about what they need to do. Never forget that you're talking to a community that has repeatedly gotten a raw deal in this country. Never forget that. Don't talk to these people like somehow the American government over the course of its history has been a friend to black people in the black community. We need to have some context here and be very, very clear about the conversation we've had over, the course of our existence. And that should inform the conversation that we're having now.
It seemed to me in that way that this article was actually kind of in dialogue with the article that I remember reading from you first was in The Atlantic. I think it might have been your first Atlantic piece about Bill Cosby and his kind of tour of making this case about sort of African-American culture and how it was behind a lot of problems that African-Americans were having. And through your writing, I think there's been a lot of engagement, particularly with President Obama, and his kind of arguments on this. And I feel like there's always been this part of your writing that is sort of arguing with this kind of scolding thread in sort of American discourse towards African Americans. And this seemed to me to kind of be about that and then turn around. That as opposed to being sort of reactive to that narrative, to be trying to set out a vision of what you thought the correct narrative actually was, to kind of set a different frame for that entire conversation. Did you think about it like that? I mean, how much did you see it as part of this procession?
I am vaguely aware that I am interested in certain things. And you can probably look at most of my magazine work in The Atlantic and just trace a thread, right? As you said, from that Cosby Cosby piece right to here. But I think the deeper thing, I can't think of the woman's name. You know this book, The Submerged State.
Yeah.
Metzler,
Suzanne Metzler.
Suzanne Metzler. And, I've read pieces of it. I gotta, give myself some time to just absorb that whole thing. But, this basic idea of how things that are done by, a state or by government somehow become the property of individuals. So it's very clear that housing as we know it today in America could not exist without government. It's just,
Right.
I mean, this was not, people walking out, out into the wilds and then putting a pole down and saying, I'm going to build my house here. I mean, it's very, very clear. Government's hand is all over it. And yet somehow in the iconography of what housing is, of what the suburbs is, it's seen as like an individual achievement.
Yeah.
Buying into the American dream, you somehow individually achieve something. And so where we see the hand of government and where we see the power of individuals, and how those two things are conflated and confused is fascinating, to me, specifically to African Americans. If you say that African Americans have, an inferior culture, have, cultural pathologies that they're carrying with them, it seems to me you have to ask why that would be. Mm-hmm. Like, why would that, like my whole, beginning of, like where I start any argument when it comes to African Americans, when it comes to race, is that whatever action here makes sense. Now, it doesn't mean it's a good action. I want that,
Mm-hmm.
To be very clear here. It doesn't mean it's a good action. It doesn't mean it should be applauded, but that it makes sense. And it likely has something to do with something that's going on. So when you hear people say things like, well, you're just being irresponsible, why? Why would you be irresponsible? For instance, if you look at, the rates of, present fathers in the African American community, you can observe that maybe, African American fathers are less present than, say, white fathers, right? Let's just put that out there. The next question is, why would that be? Is it because African American fathers are irresponsible? Why? Why? On some level, I feel like in these, conversations, we either have to get to actual historical processes or we got to get to genetics.
Yeah.
One or the other, and we haven't totally rejected genetics, but I think mostly we have. So, in many ways, culture becomes like a cover for something else. What's actually happening? If you say an individual is not exercising, okay, so I understand that about my son, right? Like I understand that on a one-to-one basis. You can say Ta-Nehisi is not being responsible. Got it. But when you're talking about thousands and millions of people, what is it about a community of millions that would make them less responsible? How can that be? What's going on there? So I've been, since that time over the past 6 years, just trying to dig at that as best I can.
What is the answer you'd give at this point? I mean, that's it. The way you frame that question is not the way it's framed in this article, and
Right.
actually not really even the way I've seen it framed
Right.
on your site.
Right.
So if that's kind of the question animating it, what at this point is the answer?
Well,
Even if
I
it's
think,
provisional?
there's part of me, because this is so rejected that I feel even stupid saying this. It's like when you have no consensus, you're out here by yourself saying, but, to me, it's pretty clear. I mean, the African American community is one of the oldest ethnic groups in this country. We've been here since 1619, okay? If you examine, an alien came to this country and said, okay, I'm going to do a thorough examination of what the policy, in the colonial times and the history of America also, what was the policy, of this country and its, ancestor colonies? That person would have to conclude that policy was one trying to ensure these people occupied a peon class, ensuring failure. When I approach it that way, when I think, when I remember that the epoch, the period for which enslavement in this country lasted was 250 years. Freedom's only lasted 150 years, and that freedom has been really, really halting. For at least 100 of those years, you can question how much freedom it actually was. We have 50 years of kind of trying to fix 350 years of really, really immoral wrong. When you think of it that way, I'm not sure how it becomes much of a question. Like, it just seems like common sense. It's pretty clear. If I said, I'm going to spend 350 years mistreating a group of people, and in 50 years haltingly going back and forth, kind of trying to fix it, kind of not, or maybe I'll just, stop doing some of the worst stuff I was doing. Well, what would be your expectation for the socioeconomic indicators for that group of people? Looked at it from that perspective, I think African Americans are about exactly where we would expect them to be.
There's something in not just that answer, but in the article that I think until you wrote it this way that I'd not thought about. You said early on there that there has been a intentional policy of creating a peon class. And something I think you go through in the article, the hardest parts of the article to read are not about the monetary plunder. It's not people taking other people's wealth. There's an airness to that, even if it's horrific.
Right.
The hardest part of the article to read was about the breaking up of families.
Right.
And at the top of the article, you get into something else, which I think is much more important than I think even we really know how to talk about. It's this idea that you can rely on the rule of law. The difference between an entrepreneur or a family who thinks they can rely on the rule of law and the state to protect them and to protect their business, and one who doesn't, right? We have this incredible lionization of risk takers. It's a hell of a lot easier to take risk if you believe your property is going to be protected if you get it. And that it's kind of the totality of that. What I thought was so stark in your piece was it's the totality of what got taken in terms of how that would make you think about how to operate in an economy or in your own life.
Right.
You know, I think in something you do that's interesting is you don't really go into sort of what reparations would mean. And one of the things the piece convinced me is there almost is no way to repair some of this. That they're just, you can't remake families you broke up 150 years ago. But it has to have some kind of effect.
Right. No, and I think there's a sociologist, and I'm blanking on his name. He's going to kill me for this. He wrote this book about Chicago, a great American city, that was very influential on my work. I'm so sorry I'm blanking on his name. It's the cameras. But we were having a discussion online, over email, about this culture thing. He had seen some of the debates I'd had, and he, wanted to engage, and we went back and forth. And knowing him as a sociologist, I wanted to make sure I was as sharp as I was. And he was talking about culture, and one of the things he was saying, like we were talking about, say, like the stop snitching thing, which was big for a moment. If you live within the community and you've experienced the police, for instance, if you know like that, if you do in fact snitch, that there will be no protection for you, by the police. The police actually can't protect you. If you know that the police sometimes are not, always, the most law-abiding themselves, that creates a certain attitude that you then carry forth through authority. That's a very, very small example. What I ask people to think about when they, hear about like the contract loan situation I talk about in the article, when I ask them to think about people losing their homes and being evicted, it's not just the people who are being evicted. I ask them to think about the community around who watches that happen, who knows that this person works 3 jobs, the wife works 2 jobs, they got 3 kids they're really trying to take care of, and they got evicted. And if you're a 15-year-old kid, you're struggling with school, you're having whatever issues a 15-year-old kid, might have, and you see that happening in your community, there's a message being sent about, what the social contract is between you and this country. And then there's a whole other world that you see, and I'm talking personally here, that you see when you cut on the TV. And you know that somewhere out there, people aren't living like you're living. It's just you. It's just you. That got to leave you feeling a certain way about your country.
Why did you do this as an article, not a book?
That's a good question. Well, I work for The Atlantic.
A lot of people work for The Atlantic.
They write
do them as books, not articles.
Books. Well, the thing is this. I thought it would have much more impact. First of all, I think the cover of The Atlantic, and specifically the cover they designed, actually. I hate to say this, but books get ignored all the time.
Yeah.
The cover space of The Atlantic, it may be, in terms of, the world of ideas, it may be the most valuable in all the magazines. Which is not to say there aren't other magazines that do great articles, but The Atlantic is one of the last ones that really just puts its ideas out front and has a certain heritage and cachet. So, for the magazine that I work for, to say, yeah, we should talk about reparations, that's going to attract some attention, So that was the main reason. And also, I adore my editors at The Atlantic. I just absolutely adore them. And after the last, really big piece I did for them, the only message I got back was, go out there. Go out there, as long as you can substantiate it, go out there, find something for us. Find something, big, some big idea. So.
What was, on the other side of that question, you run a blog. Actually, and I think it's like, and I actually mean that like sort of in the old sense, right? Like,
although less and less every day, it's so funny.
Maybe
it's
that's
changing.
right.
But
like,
no, I hear what you're saying.
But blogging used to kind of mean a kind of writing, right? It had a voice, and it was in conversation with your readers, and a lot of people who began as bloggers, myself included, have kind of like moved into these other places where it's merged much more with other kinds of writing, where it has more institutional voice, where it is kind of more about the next article as opposed to the ongoing conversation.
Right.
And your blog, I think, is arguably the best example of like an ongoing conversation with readers that exists anywhere on the internet. And I'm curious kind of the role that the blog played in this piece, because I think that the sort of traditional view of bloggers is that they can't even think long. And yet it felt to me like, you could see this piece coming together week by week on the blog. I mean, there was a sense of recognition reading it, sort of understanding how all these different things I'd read and these different conversations you were starting were sort of being woven together into the whole.
Yeah, no. Since I started blogging in January 2008, that's largely been true. It is I mean, it's an online, it's a blog. It's what it says it is. It's a log, on the World Wide Web of, my thinking that's interactive. It played a big role because first of all, like you just had this notebook where you can just write, okay, this is what I'm thinking. I read this and here's what I'm taking from it, right? But then I'm lucky enough that I have like graduate students and historians and sociologists themselves who will then write in, who will jump in the comments section and say, you should check out this. I know you thought this, but you should really look at this. It was huge. It was absolutely huge. The book I mentioned at the top, Burl Satter's Family Properties, I'm pretty sure somebody in the comment section suggested that to me. I know I didn't stumble into that on my own. It's gigantic if you want it to be. I don't really, I know people say that. I don't understand how blogging keeps you from writing long. If you want to write long, you'll write long. You know what I mean? That's about. I understand how if somebody said to you, you got to, blog 10 items a day, how that would keep you from writing long. I understand that. How the churn can, right? But the other piece of that is people say, well, the reward of having published something will keep you from writing. Nothing, can, equal the reward I got from publishing that Reparations. There's nothing that's going to come close to that.
Well, I think the other thing that, I don't know if people are thinking about this exactly, but something I think about a bit is that there is I think something that was true early on was that a difference you had between people who kind of emerged in the blogging medium and people who kind of emerged in institutional spaces in journalism is that there's a provisionality in blogging. It's okay if this isn't the final word. It's okay if this may not even be the right word. You want it to be right, but you recognize you're kind of in a conversation. And if you're writing sort of in the first person, if you're saying, I think, or this is my reaction, it leaves a space for you to be wrong. That publishing in a newspaper, publishing in a magazine doesn't. And one of the interesting things is a sort of transition, right? I mean, the Ta-Nehisi Coates personal blog, something that you are particularly, I think, very good at doing and very committed to doing is making clear kind of the person behind the site, making clear that you are trying to learn, that you are sometimes wrong. And then you move to this article, right? And this article does not have a lot of space for, I may not be getting this right. I'm just trying, I'm trying to do a better job being a journalist. I mean, there's a difference in the way between those two places that I think it's often, I think, tough for writers to navigate, but you sort of navigate both, I think, to the sort of the extreme provisional side. And then also in a space like this to the extreme definitional side.
Right. Well, you spend like a year and a half, just trying stuff out, practicing things, and then eventually you start getting to some conclusions. No, this is what it is. But I think it's very, very important to have that other space. I mean, I that article would look to, I almost can't imagine that article without blogging. Again, a good deal of the sources I got, because I was writing about it. And the other thing is, people don't realize this because you don't tell them what the article's about that you're working on. But a great many of the arguments, had already been tried out, on the blog. You already debated this. I already had this. I looked at, what was the strongest argument about X, Y, and Z? Okay, I looked at that, thought about that. So very rarely, I mean, even in the response to this piece, there's almost nothing that's caught me off guard. And that's what I always worry about. Like, I'm always like, okay, well, what argument am I missing here that I need to answer? I think a lot about that. What's the strongest possible argument that can be made against it? Then I write really hard to answer that. I don't, and journalists unfortunately do this, columnists do this a lot, where they take, the weakest argument and try to answer that. No, I want the person who is, being the most intellectually honest, making the case, and then you try to go answer that.
So there's, though, to pick up on that, there's an argument you kind of don't answer on this, that you kind of leave as a big open space, and that is the argument that, everything you say is right. That the legacy not just of slavery, but of lack of rule of law, of housing discrimination, of discriminatory policing of everything is real and it's powerful and it's had an effect. But that reparations are too politically hard. They would tear the country apart. They would lead to more racism, not less. They would lead to more anger, not less. That it's impossible to kind of decide who they would go to. And you have, I think, a very interesting way of dealing with it, which you say, there's a bill by Congressman Conyers that just would study it. Why don't we just study it? But if we pass that bill, at some point we would kind of get to that next step.
We would.
And I'm curious what you think would happen there, because something I noticed in the piece, you had a great piece on your blog after the article came out about how you went from being against reparations to being for them. And in it, you published the email you sent to your editor
Right.
proposing the piece. And one thing you say in there, the proposed conclusion in that initial email is, I think there might be a case for President Obama to come out for reparations.
Yeah.
And you say, nope, actually, I've come to the different conclusion.
Yeah,
that would be a bad
got to
idea.
I thought it was a terrible idea.
But so, if you think that it would be such a bad idea for the sort of leader of the country to do so, I'm curious, sort of.
Well, see, it would not be a bad idea for the leader of the country to do it. It would be a bad idea for Barack Hussein Obama to do it. It can only get. I mean, there's all this data on how he polarizes everything. He can only polarize this.
Yeah.
He can only make it worse. I mean, it can't. If he.
Remember that Onion article the night before the election? You ever see that?
No.
I think now is the time to talk about reparations by Barack Obama.
No, I mean, if he, everything. What is it? There's some research. They show a picture of the dog.
Yeah,
but
this
then
is
they
one of my
find
favorites.
out it's Obama's and they hate it.
If you show people Portuguese water poodle and say it's Ted Kennedy, say that's a good dog. If you show people with high levels of racial resentment, Obama said it's a bad dog.
Right.
But you made this kind of choice to leave this sort of ultimate question of what. Okay, we should talk about reparations. Well, what are we talking about? I'm curious a little bit about your thinking behind that choice.
Well, because I think, I think people think like I'm dodging or something. No, I mean, we literally need a study. I mean, I've seen your site, and how you, looked at. I think you in particular looked at some of the math behind what slavery is and that sort of thing. The problem is we aren't just talking about that.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you, okay, so we take that, and then you say take like just the blanket wave of terrorism, domestic homegrown terror that just washed over the country for about 100 years. You add to that, say, like the AP story that I allude to about the land that was just straight taken from people that we know that happened too. You add into that the flaws in the New Deal, the housing aspect. Oh my God! I mean, you start calculating what African Americans missed out on housing. That has to be just some ridiculous number. Okay, but I think we should know what that number is. I think first of all we should know what that number is. But then even after that, even if it's like, okay, we can't pay that back. Or maybe we should think about this in all of our policy going forward. To make this perfectly concrete for you, here's the way I would think about this. In a world in which, in an America in which, you could talk about reparations openly, and you wouldn't get this sort of, it wouldn't be this sort of explosive thing that it is now. We would talk about the Affordable Care Act, and part of what we would talk about is undoing past injustice to Black people, and we would actually say that. We would say that. We would say, listen, this is, something that's going to help everybody. But yes, it will disproportionately help Black people. And that's a really, really good thing. Because for 350 years, we tried to disadvantage Black people. So we should do that. We would talk about policy, in a very specific way. And I think liberals particularly right now, like we try to bury it. We try to do the other thing, actually. We know that it'll disproportionately help Black people. And somewhere in the back of our minds, we do know that's a good thing. But we really want to emphasize, no, it'll help everybody. Now that might be like a flight of fancy in terms of what is politically possible right now. Let me cite one other example before I answer that though. In a world where people, not just are for reparations, but understand their history, understand that there's a debt to be paid, understand that there was damage done. When a Supreme Court justice, no less, says something like the way to end discrimination on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. Anybody with any sort of knowledge of that history would laugh at him.
And this is Chief Justice Roberts.
This is Chief Justice Roberts. Because what they would understand right away is that America has never discriminated. I've said this before, but it's never discriminated on the basis of race. Race was, as we understand it, race was invented by racism. And America has always, up until fairly recently, discriminated on the basis of racism. That's what we want to undo. That's what we want to undo. And we would understand that. Redlining would not be a shock. It wouldn't be a shock. We wouldn't think that this ended in 1968. I think it would have a profound effect on our policy. And people talk about reparations in this way. For instance, Charles Ogletree, who brought suit on behalf of the race riots in Oklahoma. When I interviewed him, that was exactly actually how he talked about reparations. His thing was that this should be part of a broader social justice thing, that the legacy of African Americans should inform programs and policies that we know would disproportionately help Black people, but might help other people who are not Black too. It's very important to say that though. I mean, it's not just, you can't just know that, and I think as we are want to do for political reasons, understandable political reasons, liberals are want to not, explicitly talk about the history and who this, what will specifically help. It needs to be talked about.
So if I understand what you're saying, let me try to echo it back to you. So there is a somewhat pervasive rhetorical move among liberals where you begin a conversation about affirmative action.
Right.
and it moves immediately to a conversation about class-based affirmative action. You say, well, that wasn't the
Right.
point. They say, well,
Right.
this will disproportionately help African Americans.
Right.
Anyway, it might even do a better job.
Right.
And what you're saying actually isn't that the problem is talking about class-based affirmative action. You're saying that it might actually be the right thing to have a class-based affirmative action policy that you justify on racial grounds, so long as you are actually talking about the intent of the policy. The point isn't the policies have to be.
I think part of, like, specifically with the example of affirm, specifically that part of the problem is that so there's the class-based piece, but the other piece of this is it becomes diversity, which is the absolute. I mean, there's an argument for diversity. There's an argument for class-based affirmative action, and it might be that class-based affirmative action is ultimately the best way to help African Americans, right? But that really isn't a moral argument against anti-racist affirmative action specifically meant to help black people. Now, as we know, since Bakke, you haven't been able to make that argument, which is part of the reason why liberals make other arguments. But
Bakke being the Supreme Court case.
Yes. But the queasiness about that goes back, as I say in the piece, it goes back before that. Lyndon Johnson's people were queasy about this. I mean, how do we say, we know that there's been some sort of debt accrued, how do we say that we're specifically gonna deal with this? We know that African Americans are suffering in a way that other people are not. How do we say that we're going to have some level of policy that's going to be specifically engineered to deal with them? I suspect, and this is just me spitballing because I don't know, because we don't have HR 40 yet, but I suspect that what you would have is some, combination, some sort of cocktail of remedies, which would be, some of it would be probably class-based, some of it would be, specifically anti-racist, designed directly to deal with African Americans. Probably would be, some sort of mix of things. But that's why we need a study. It was not, in an attempt to, like, avoid, something. I mean, I spent 16,000 words writing, making the case for why this should happen, right? I would love to spend another 16,000 telling you what that might look like. It would be my honor to do that. But what that would entail would not be, me just, writing, spending a week, sort of doing the math and then writing that out. I mean, I would want to travel to, for instance, to other countries and find, okay, so can I find something analogous where somebody has some sort of great historical sin and they've had to deal with it, with the population still living in that country? What did they do? How successful was it? Because what you need to understand is, are we at the, limits of human justice itself? Or is this something that we just, haven't figured out? I think when people see study, and that's because, we get, like, reports, like, there are constantly reports that are never acted on, that never go anywhere. But study is more than, at least in my eyes, it's more than just a few people sitting in a room and then, producing a briefing paper. I mean, this is actually a deep question about humanity and human justice.
When you think about something like HR 40, or when you just think about reparations in general, I think one of the interesting questions is, are you trying to target justice, or are you trying to target some kind of outcome? And the answer obviously can be both, but it's relatively, I think, I don't want to say easy, but it's a matter of arithmetic to say, here's what the wealth gap is. Here's how much money we would need to transfer to close the wealth gap. And we're going to use that as a kind of a rough sort of calculation of what it is. And then it's kind of another to say, here's what is owed. Here is what is owed in a kind of moral debt in this country because of what we've done. And I feel like a study might be able to answer the first question. A study can probably, based on a certain set of parameters, like, help you target outcomes. I kind of am skeptical, as much as I'm like a technocrat, of a study being able. I mean, I've read a lot of studies on this, and your article was a lot more powerful than they were. And it's because I feel like the language of studies, and frankly, the tools they have. I don't know how you.
But see, I think again though, like, if we thought.
And I'd like to read the study, by the way.
Yes. Well, first of all, I think the point you make, obviously, nothing can answer for the immorality act. Nothing can make that right. All right, let's so stipulate that when Germany paid reparations, it didn't make it right. It wasn't, and people feared that, but it most certainly didn't. And I don't think anybody thinks that it made it right. I suspect that on some level we have, like, a dialogue that we could have about, like, what social programs or what we might do to close the wealth gap. But I think what you're alluding to is the profound injury in terms of morality, in terms of the state as a whole. Does it have to just be programs? I mean, are we talking about what our museums look like, for instance? Are we talking about, for instance, what our curriculum should look like? I know we don't have a national curriculum. we're getting close, right? We're getting with this Common Core. But what students should learn, what should be, what are there specific days that should be set aside for certain things?
All the Common Core people out there are excited that you just associated Common Core and reparations.
Right. They're very happy. They're very happy to hear that, right? They're very happy to hear that. Yeah, reparations curriculum coming soon. But it doesn't just have to be limited to social programs. It really, really doesn't. A world in which we would have reparations is a very, very different America.
Yeah.
It's a very, very different America. It's a different America than the one we live in right now. But sometimes talking about that different world is the way you get to that different world. I think I always tell, listen, 1860, anybody who was calling for the mass abolition of all black people who were enslaved in the South was considered crazy. That wasn't even Abraham Lincoln's position. It wasn't the Republican Party. This was the party ostensibly of abolition. It was not their position that all people, all slaves should be, immediately liberated. It was Frederick Douglass's position, and when he was advocating it, it seemed, totally and completely unlikely. Did that mean that he then therefore shouldn't say it? That's really, and I think this is actually a question for pundits, intellectuals, writers, people who have the public space, okay? Because I think often we confuse ourselves with Senate aides. Maybe because often there's an overlap, So what you end up talking about is what could possibly get past, make it, past a 60 vote, past a filibuster. Right. And that becomes the paradigm for all we talk about. What are our politics like right now? Let's talk within that narrow space. And that's probably because, writers, intellectuals, pundits, analysts, they want to have impact. You know what I mean? They want to have, they want to be say, I wrote this and then this happened. That's what you hope to happen. But what happened to imagination? I think that's actually an important world. Not the world we live in now, but the world we hope to live in. I think people need to write compellingly about that. I have a friend, whose name, who shall go unmentioned, mutual friend, I'll tell you once we're off camera, who keeps saying he wants to write this piece arguing that private school in America should be abolished. I would love to read that piece. I'm not even sure I agree with him, but it's so far out, you know what I mean? And as he made the case, it was, interrogating so many things. I was on a school tour with my son today. That's probably why it's on the brain at a private school. And it was just morally just outrageous, offensive. But we have to say things that are way, way out. You know what I mean? That may be correct and impossible also. I don't think we're improved by just sort of living right here, within the confines of what our politics are right now.
But one of the point you make about being a Senate aide, and I'm a guy who has basically built my career on writing what can't pass a filibuster.
Right.
But it seems to me that
we need people to do that, but everybody shouldn't do that.
But this is what I think is interesting about sort of the path you've taken, I'd say, over the last year. A theme in your work, in your blog over the last year has been a real lurch towards history and the sort of historian's way of knowing. Right? That you've really, I think, had some fairly impassioned, I think, debates or disagreements with people who have been angry that you've gotten what they've said more depressed, you've gotten more fatalistic. And that, I think that you have political journalism, right, which is the place where people who end up commenting on politics tend to come from. They have modes of knowing. I have modes of knowing, right? Where I call Senate aides, right? And I read books by people involved in the political process. And I feel like your work has gotten bigger and more radical the more you've moved away from that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And just to be clear, I'm not arguing against calling Senate aides. I'm certainly not.
I'm making America worse. I get it.
No. That needs to happen, and then other things need to happen too. I think one of the things that has sort of amazed me is if I, assembled a panel of, political scientists, economists, sociologists, historians, and, people have done this. I've been lucky enough to travel around, and people have done this for me, and we've gotten into a room. What that conversation sounds like, and what the conversation sounds like when I talk to people who write, for magazines or publications or websites, it's wholly, wholly different.
Yeah.
It amazes me. And I haven't quite been able to put my finger on why, but if folks think what I am saying is depressing, I dropped out of school, so I have a hard time understanding this because the people who are teaching, the next generation of people who are going to be doing this writing are just, I don't know, they lay it all out there. I'm struggling because I don't want to call them fatalistic because I don't think they are, I think what they do have think what they do have, I think what academics generally have, is a realistic view of humanity. Listen, I'm an American.
That is an unusual sentence you just gave there.
What
academics do have is a realistic view of humanity.
in their writing, maybe not in their politics, within the departments, but
they do have. I actually agree with this, but they have a perspective.
Yes, they do. Right.
They are forced to have a perspective.
Right.
That is bigger than they are and bigger than their intuition.
Right. I mean, you can't be a historian of any respect and write, the adventures of Flaggy and Ribbon. You just can't. You can't do that. You may, be American. You may be very happy to be American. You may be very proud of America. Wouldn't want to live anywhere else. But at the end of the day, you have to view your country, as a state within world history. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the way you had this, and there's no room for religion or theology or myth really in that. You can't. In fact, you got to kind of reject that. You got to get that out of your head. And try to take some sort of, objective, and this is why I keep hammering this point. If you take a view of African-American history, and I think I say this in the piece, and you say, okay, what is the relationship, the American state to the African-American community across the broad swath of time? I mean, what are you going to say?
Yeah.
I mean, you can't, you're not going to say, hey, everything is great. And I'm going to go so far as to say, you can't even say, things were bad before and they're getting better now, because we've had about 50 years of just kind of getting better. Nothing is assured. No one knows. No one knows. We hope to, continue to get better. That's what we hope. That's what you hope. And if that happens, that'll be great. But as it stands now, I mean, you have to just take a realistic sense of where we are, and you just can't be afraid to say that.
I had a history professor in college who had what he called the 90-90-90 rule. Mm-hmm. And he said that 90% of Americans forget 90% of what's happened within 90 days. And he compared it to World War I, where they got into a world war based on grievances from hundreds of years previous. Mm-hmm. But he said that that at times that's been a great advantage of this country because it can forget so fast that it can renew itself very rapidly. Mm-hmm. But if you widen that aperture, right. If you stop forgetting so quickly, things look a whole lot different.
Right.
I mean, to circle back to where we began, the man who begins your piece is alive, and terrible things happen in his life.
That's right.
Terrible things happen that were not done by a distant past, not done by people who have a sepia tone in photographs or no photographs at all.
Right.
And one of the reasons I think that you have this good line in there that there's a kind of a laughter that masks a fear when you begin talking about this, that it's so much easier to forget.
Right. Well, I think, just to amend that though, Ezra, I think we do remember. I think we remember the things that flatter us.
Fair. That's fair.
Nobody's going to forget George Washington,
Well, they forget a lot of it.
Well, yes. You're exactly right. They do forget a lot of him, but they remember the part that flatters themselves.
Yeah, that's totally right.
We remember the part that flatters ourselves.
Yeah.
Again, on some level, this becomes existential questions. Can a state create the kind of memory that, say, a mother has of a child, or a brother has of a sister, where you love somebody, right? Mm-hmm. But you don't think that they're perfect. But you would leap in front of a truck for them, nevertheless. Can a state have that kind of patriotism? Can that kind of love for country actually exist? Or is the only kind of love of country where, we're the best, we're better than everybody else, and, we've never done anything wrong. And if we did do anything wrong, everything about our goods so clearly outweigh our bads that we don't even really need to talk about it.
It's really interesting to hear you bring up this concept of memory here, because in a way I feel like this is what the piece is about. That one of the things you leave is there's an accounting about reparations that is the work of this sort of possible study committee. But that one of the things that no matter what form it ultimately took, it would be, one of the things that the reparations would be kind of a restoration of this memory, not just this kind of idea that there was slavery and then we fought it and we had this great national cleansing and then it was over, but that that there would be a recognition of kind of what the history here actually was, and that would be part of the package actually.
Right. And this isn't as depressing as people think, because, I'm reading this, I just finished Ron Chernow's book of Washington, that's why he was on my brain. And I'm now reading Henry Weinsack's book, which is just about Washington and slavery. And as bad as things are, you see these glints of individual nobility, you know what I mean? Where people recognize this is horrible. I'm going to try really, really hard to do the right thing here. And sometimes they succeed. Very often they don't. But those are the moments that, even me, all the way out here with my radicalism, you come to some greater understanding, about America. I think, like you take like Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address. Yeah, it's not just, a sort of profound, statement, on the country, but it's just a profound statement on freedom, period. Period. I mean, there are all of these moments like this through American history. When you talk about something like the Civil War, okay, on some level you're talking about, at the end, by the end of the conversation, you're talking about, liberation and enslavement, right? But you're also talking about, at that point in history, one of the few functioning, quote unquote, even theoretical democracies in the world. Can that continue or not? Can that continue? I mean, and it did. There's something to be said there. I guess what I'm saying is you don't, at the end of, all of this accounting, have to hang your head. And here's the other thing. Other states have to do their accounting too. America's not like, uniquely evil or something. You know what I mean? It's not like, I spent a great deal of my time talking about the force of white supremacy and racism in America. But if I were in France, where I was last year, I guarantee you, just looking around, I could find something there too. This is just true of society's period. And I think, if we can sort of accept that about ourselves, accept our own humanity, and accept that that's okay. And also, can I add, just get away from this sense of individual guilt. So when I talk about reparations, I am talking about America as a country, as a state, as a society. I am not talking about white people. And that's, I got to be really clear. And we understand, that the state, acted, to benefit white people. But ultimately, the whole society has to come to some sort of accounting. When we're talking about redlining, we're talking about things that the American government did. So, like the counter you get is, well, what specific white people are going to pay? I didn't, but you're part of the society. You're part of the state, and the state outlives you. You know what I mean? When you die, the state continues. The state, has no natural. And
you benefit from the things that the people before you did.
Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. And there are people around who are being hurt by it. And so if we can get to that level, I think, and I say this in the piece, I think we actually will be much improved beyond reparations. And just to add on to that, I'm sorry you got me carried away here. The other thing I think about this is it's like, if we can't deal with this, and this is actually a question for you, how the hell are we going to deal with climate change? It seems to me that the problems are very, very similar, like getting people to face up to something that is not immediately in their interest. Like how do you get people to do that? How do you build a society that does that?
Do you actually want my answer on that?
Yes, I would. I would love your answer.
I don't think we are.
Why not?
I think that climate change is an issue that...
Now you're a pessimist.
Yeah, I'm a realist.
Right.
In 2008, John McCain and Sarah Palin had a cap and trade bill in their platform. Sarah Palin was running on a national ticket in favor of cap and trade. Her first major statement after that election was a Washington Post op-ed. I forget which, cap and tax or something, using some sort of Sarah Palinism to distance herself from it. John McCain was the first to introduce a cap and trade bill into the Senate. A couple of years ago, this debate seemed real tractable. And a couple years later, it seems almost impossible. Now, you can take a more optimistic view and you can say that'll flip quick. But I'm a structuralist about American politics. I think very little about individuals in it and what they want and what they mean, and much more about the big thing. And in that issue, I see a problem that the worst effects won't happen for a long time. That the worst effects will happen in countries that are not us. That the both the cost and of the problem and of the solution would be highly regionally dispersed. And an effective solution would require a level of global cooperation there's almost no precedent for. And it's like if you wanted to design, if you wanted to weaponize an issue such that both the American political system and to some degree the international one couldn't deal with it, that is how you would make it, right? And that most of the serious solutions to it in some form or another are basically attacks, which is something we have weird quasi-religious feelings about in American politics. I would not be pessimistic if climate change were an issue like the budget or even like healthcare, where you can let it fester for a long time, but then you can flip the switch, right? And you've caused a lot of damage, but you can fix it. But once you get 600 parts per million of carbon particles in the air, you're done. And so I just don't think we're going to get there in time. We just got barely a not quite universal healthcare bill after roughly 100 years of trying, 80 years of trying. So
can I just say,
I'm
I
just
think
not
it's very
confident.
important. Like, I think it's very important for people to talk like that. I just do. I think we have a tendency in this country, for whatever reason, and maybe in all countries, to think that, I think in this country actually, we win in the end. We win in the end.
Yeah.
What if we don't? Until we don't, and I think like we need to have the possibility in front of us that we don't, and I think, just to, switch this back, because I think about these things together all the time. We need to face the possibility that, until the end of this country, Black people might never be equal. That's a possibility. I mean, that could happen.
Mm-hmm.
I think, we see, Jackie Robinson, 1960s, Voting Rights Act, Obama, clearly we're, progressing towards a place where there's going to be equality.
Right.
Maybe not. Maybe not.
Something that you actually wrote about just this week was the way this article and this perspective of yours, this kind of more realist perspective, let's put it, stands on the shoulders of the Academy.
Yes.
And stands on the shoulders. What would be kind of a reading list here?
Yes.
What are some of the things that, if people cared about this and were touched by this and wanted to sort of understand, follow some of the intellectual path you've walked, where would you tell them to go?
So the intellectual godmother of this piece is Isabel Wilkerson's incredible book, The Warmth of Other Suns.
That is an incredible book.
Yeah, no, just epic. I mean, it's just you can't say enough, about Isabel Wilkerson's work. Professor Wilkerson is reversing one of the sort of commonly held views on the Great Migration, and that is that you had a flood of people from the South who came up here who were totally unprepared for city life, and that explains a lot about what happened in our northern cities. And through, painstaking, meticulous work, like looking at actual sociology and all this other stuff, she proves that in many cases, these folks were better educated than the Black communities that were already there. In a few cases, they were better educated than the white immigrant, communities that were there. Very often, they actually came from cities and not, straight like plantation in Chicago, the story that you always hear. Mm-hmm. In many cases, these were people who were married. These were people who did find work. These were people who did, were church going, basically doing everything that, America says that people should do. How were they then rewarded? And that was like, that's a question that she, an answer that she, lays out throughout the book. And what you see, I mean, after I finished it was, a kind of almost effort to ensure that there was no successful Black middle class. I hate to speak in those terms, but it's very hard to avoid that conclusion when you see people, working their butt off and you see the kind of rewards they got. So that's a really important one. Burl Satter's book, Family Properties, is extremely, extremely important. History of redlining and housing in general in Chicago with a focus on North Lawndale and a focus on the contract buying system. Kenneth Jackson's Crabgrass Frontier. Absolutely, absolutely essential. It's ostensibly another one of these books that's ostensibly a history of the suburbs in America, but actually ends up having a lot to do with race, white supremacy, and redlining. Inevitably, it has to get to that. Arnold Hirsch's book, Making the Second Ghetto, all about Chicago, and just a great, great pattern of some of the most, probably one of the most forgotten waves of terrorism in American history, and that is the housing riots against people in Chicago, and again, how Black people were greeted as they went into these neighborhoods, just absolutely, absolutely essential. And then engaging in some of the broader questions, about justice and that sort of thing. I think Tony Judd's book, Post-War, History of Europe after World War II, is very, very much obsessed with this question of forgetting and what we remember and what we don't. In fact, Judd kind of argues that it's good that societies forget. I think that was an absolutely huge one. Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, another one, just really obsessed with memory and what happens when you have just a horrendous, atrocities and how countries, deal with that and process that through memory. And the last one that I would recommend is Ira Katznelson's Fear Itself, which you are very familiar with. Yeah. History of New Deal politics in America. Professor Katznelson, really, between that book and his other book, When Affirmative Action Was White, did a lot of work in terms of just educating me on how the New Deal was passed and what it left open. Also, I would recommend Robert Sampson's Great American City and Patrick Sharkey's Stuck in Place, and I would recommend them in tandem because these are two sociologists who kind of come out of the William Julius Wilson, School of Sociology, and that is that we have to understand neighborhoods That even, traditionally when people talk about race, which we'll try to do is we'll say, okay, let's look at black people of this income, white people of this income, see what the outcomes are and try to figure out what's going on here. Or even wealth. Wealth is another one. Let's look at, wealth, black family with X wealth, white family. Why are we getting different outcomes? And what Sampson and Sharkey in both of these works show is that, no, think about neighborhood. Think about the neighborhoods that these people live in. Don't think about them, because if you think about how people actually function, they function as communities, who you know, who you see, what your daily, interactions are. And that, is that way has really, you talk about pessimism. You want to be, that will make you very, very pessimistic. Sharkey shows, for instance, in his work, the income gap has really not changed at all. Where African-American families live, regardless of income, as compared to where white families live. And I'm talking about what the income tends to be around them. It's ridiculous. So if I'm for instance, a black family, on average, I think his numbers, black family on average bringing in about $100,000 a year, tends to live in the same neighborhood that a white family making about $30,000 lives, in terms of the quality of the neighborhood. These present like serious challenges to where we are. Sampson looks at all of the neighborhoods in Chicago and produces this stunning graph of like the rates of incarceration. And on one side, you can see like just a line like this, and on one side you can see all of the white neighborhoods, and on the other side you see all of the black neighborhoods way up here. Even the black neighborhood with the lowest incarceration rate has some, degree, of number, some ridiculous number times the rate of the highest incarcerated white neighborhood. These are books make, just a really, really powerful argument taken together for the regrettable persistence of racism, in our country. They were essential to me.